Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending where you are. I'm Tony Zhou from Inspiris Institute, your host today. Welcome to the second webinar of Laban series, Laban and Somatics, presented by Inspiris Institute in partnership with Laban Bartenieff Institute of Movement Studies, LIMS, and CAT Journal. Today, we're very glad to have Karen Stad from LIMS join us and share her knowledge about the Laban Bartenieff movement system and its connection to somatics in global perspectives. Karen is a LIMS program coordinator and has taught in several training programs worldwide. Karen was also one of my teachers in Laban certification program in Belgium, and I really enjoy her ways of teaching. And since last year, she has been coordinating and teaching in our program in China. Karen is also the co-author of Everybody's Body, a book on human movement, which has been translated into Chinese and will be published this month by us. So now I'm going to switch the presenting role to Karen. Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'm really delighted to be here doing this, and hello to everyone. It's really nice to see the names of both people I recognize and people I don't recognize. This idea of a ever-expanding global community comes to mind in looking at this list. So this is just close to my heart because I've been doing a lot of trying to take this material out into the world, and so I appreciate it to see this connection to all of you out there. So as Tony said, I'm going to start by talking and showing my PowerPoint rather than looking at my face. You'll look at a screen. Talking about the Laban Bartenieff movement system itself so that we can set somatics in a context of that system. And so both my introduction to the LBMS system, Laban Bartenieff movement system, as well as somatics, somatic practice, both will be fairly rudimentary brief introductions due to the amount of time we have. And much of it will be familiar to most of you, but hopefully it will be a way to summarize and capture kind of the essence of this bigger picture. All right, so I'm now going to switch to sharing my screen with you guys and get my PowerPoint up and going. Okay. All right. Okay. So as I stated, many of you will be familiar with the idea of LMA and BF. So one of the things that I've been working on doing is really having more synthesis between what those two parts of a whole are, and not so much identifying them by their separate parts, but rather by identifying them as the whole. Obviously, as in all part-whole situations, you can identify parts, but the purpose of seeing this as an integrated system of Laban Bartenieff movement studies is not only to bring Irmgard Bartenieff into that larger sphere more dominantly or more predominantly, but also to feel more of the synthesis side of analysis. So that's for those of you who are more familiar with the idea of LMA/BF. LBMS is more of an attempt at synthesis of both sides of that coin. Okay, let's see. So why this notion of system? And so this just addresses what I was talking about. A system is a theoretical model of a whole and its component parts. A system shows relationships of the parts to the whole. A system is a set of interacting or interdependent parts forming a complex, intricate whole. And as we all know, movement is a very complex phenomena. One of the reasons that it is not well understood, one of the many reasons, is the complexity that's in the nature of movement. And that's one thing that the technological community has really been trying to grapple with, is the complexity of movement. A system is an organized, purposeful structure that consists of interrelated and interdependent parts, which can be called components, which is what we do in our system. We call the parts components, entities, factors, members, elements, and there's many other ways that we designate parts. These parts influence one another, directly or indirectly, to maintain their activity and the existence of the system, that is the whole, in order to achieve the goals of the system. So that brings us to the idea of, okay, well, what is the system of the Laban-Bartenieff movement system? What's its goals? How does it work? So it seeks to explicate this complex phenomena of human movement by identifying the patterns of movement and naming the parts. That, in a nutshell, is what it's all about. And then the applications of that are obviously extremely vast because movement is a part of all aspects of life. So this analytical part, this analytical process in which the whole is broken down into parts, the relationships of the parts are then identified. And that is where we find how action and interaction work and how we get meaning, how we glean meaning from the movement in order to understand it, to refine it, to utilize it, all of those things. So the goal of movement analysis is to reveal aspects of movement and the interpretation of movement for purposes of clarifying, modifying, understanding our patterns of action. Movement analysis provides the potential for intervention, leading to greater understanding and expanding movement potential, both functionally and expressively in multiple contexts. So you'll notice there that I have this idea of the goal of movement to reveal aspects of movement, but also the interpretation of movement. One of the things we do in the Laban-Bartenieff movement system when training people in this work or bringing it to them is in the process of observation. And observation is an action. So getting people to understand that the process of observation is an action itself is also part of this. And you'll also notice in that slide, I have talked about one of the major movement themes, this notion of function and expression, that duality. And that is also extremely significant in this system. All right, so a little bit more of this bigger overview of the big idea. Models are never true because, again, the LBMS system is a model to represent movement, but there is truth in models. We can understand what the model represents only by simplifying it. That, as we know, is also the case of language. What we do to communicate with one another is we parse our words and choose our words. And language, which is so wonderful a vehicle for communication, also, as we know, has its limitations. So we're always dealing with this paradox of how can we both understand but also limit in order to create a container for understanding. So within this system, what's intriguing is how Laban was really the person who mapped the space of our movement experience and gave language to the dynamic patterns, that is the effort expression. And he used the model of the Platonic solids to represent the mover's personal space. And that's what he identified as the kinesphere. So again, this idea of a model, that he used the models of the Platonic solids as a way to really bring understanding to the mover of what they were doing. So it's connected to this coming into movement awareness. Bartenieff mapped the body experience for optimizing our movement potential, and she used the model of the human skeletal system to organize the mover's experience of our fundamental actions. Now, it's not that Laban didn't understand that space was infinite. Obviously, he did. But he used these models, this notion of simplifying in a way, codifying and simplifying to really get to the real essence of pattern. And the same thing is true with Bartenieff. She was a physical therapist, obviously. She worked with people and knew about all the aspects of the human anatomy, including skeletal structure, etc., and muscles, joints, all of this. But she really used the framework of the skeleton as a real conceptual model to ground the understanding of the mover in their moving anatomy, rather than trying to explicate, all the muscles firing in a kinetic chain. Skeletal landmarks were used in order to help optimize movement. So this is just this way in which these two pioneers of this system, these two builders of this system, themselves used models in order to get to the essence of the complex phenomena of movement. So we are both pattern makers and pattern perceivers. And so the nature of doing this mapping is to be able to organize patterns that we both experience and patterns that we see, patterns that we want to utilize in some way. But the basic way in which we start to understand this notion of patterns is by looking at differentiation. And that is a whole developmental process, starting with part whole, self-other. And these ideas of this perceptual notion of differentiation really comes and is based in the body's form in the world, and it gives rise to how we make sense or come to know the world. And it's also how we dichotomize, up, down, give, take, here, there, you, me. So all of that we do on an ongoing process to help us understand the world around us and to come to consensus with those around us so that we can communicate and share our experience. So here we have a lovely little slide of a child in a sandbox representing the whole of this child's experience of this little world he has created, or she, and the totality of the sandbox, having its container, holding the sand, and all of the little implements that this child is using. And then on the other side, you have all of the little implements identified and categorized by organizing them into patterns. Now you'll notice that a certain kind of patterning was used here. The trucks are all together, the pails are all together, the little spatulas or scoops or shovels are all together, the little watering cans are all together. But there are other ways that we could have also made sense out of this. We could have categorized by color. We could have categorized by size, largest, all small items, all large items, all medium items. So you always have to understand that as part of breaking down the whole and doing this structuring process, we are making choices in how we are collating our data, if you will, to make sense of the world around us. And what's also fascinating to me about this picture and why I love it is that the child is now not part of this whole. The child is now sitting on the periphery, looking at all of these things, and it doesn't look like necessarily the most inviting place to be stimulated. So it also really is a good identifier for the fact that the whole and the parts are meaningless unless they're put back into the whole. You really don't understand the nature of what it is to have a child playing in a sandbox unless you see the child immersed in the process of interacting with those parts. So that's also the nature of this particular slide that I'm showing. Now, the thematic dualities that the Laban system requires us to really investigate deeply and explore profoundly, along with all of the ones that we experience in an ongoing way in our daily lives. But we explicate these more clearly in terms of the human movement experience. These are the notions of mobility, stability, inner, outer, function, expression, exertion, recuperation. And again, the system as itself is this process of analysis and synthesis, parts and whole relationship. And of course, all of you know there are many, many others that we reference: self-other, simple, complex, macro, micro, and the list goes on. This lemniscate is a really good way in which people can come into a visual and even tactile understanding of this part-whole relationship of duality, because it's a very good both three-dimensional image as well as a tactile experience. If you create one and then try to trace with your finger one side and the other, you very quickly realize that both sides are the same. As you run your finger along what is the inside surface, it soon becomes the outside surface, and again the inside surface, in this never-ending loop of its own wholeness.